This is Ben May, and I want to thank you for joining us as we continue to seek the old paths. I have enjoyed our study in the book of Genesis, and I hope that you have as well. In fact, this lesson brings us to the close of what has been a very interesting and for me personally a very profitable study. I hope that we've learned things. Maybe we've been reminded of things that we learned some time back, and hopefully we've learned some new things. And so we want to conclude the study in Genesis in this lesson, and then to very briefly look into the next study that we will take on this time next week. And let me say, by the way, that if you have not yet ordered your next study guide, now's the time to do that. And you'll see that information that'll come up on your screen from time to time. Now, last time, we talked about the death of Jacob. Now, just to sort of catch us up a little bit, remember in the book of Genesis that the main family, you might say, would be the family of Abraham. But now this didn't start till Genesis chapter 12. Before that, we talked about the events of the creation. And then, unfortunately, man became very wicked, and God brought about the flood. So we had before the flood and the flood. Well, then we saw that God wanted His people to be fruitful and multiply and just fill the earth. But man had a different idea, as is often the case. And so man decided that what we want to do is all stay together. And God said, no, I want you to scatter everywhere. And so God came down and confused their language, forced them to scatter and separate by language. And so we have the scattering of the people in Genesis chapter 11. Well, chapters 10 and 11. And then in chapter 12, we start our study of the patriarchs. Now, the primary character, again, was Abraham, remember. And remember what patriarch means? Father rule. And so God would deal directly with the head of the house. In this case, Abraham, and then Isaac, and then Jacob. And so we followed then the patriarchs all the way from Genesis chapter 12, all the way to where we are now, which is in Genesis chapter 50. There was Abraham, then his son Isaac, and Isaac's son Jacob, and then Jacob had 12 sons, remember. And then those 12 sons make up what we call the 12 tribes of Israel. Now, in studying those, we find that there's a lot of events that happen with the various sons, and we look, though, primarily at one of the sons, in fact, the 11th of the 12 sons, Joseph. Joseph ended up being sold into slavery, and he goes down to the land of Egypt. Through God's providence, Joseph rises to power, becomes second only to Pharaoh. There was a severe famine that caused Joseph's family to come down to buy grain. And from there, he gets all of his family to come down to Egypt where he could take care of them. And so we find then in our last study that Jacob, the father of those 12 sons, Jacob dies. But just before he died, remember those amazing things that he told each of his sons? And we looked at those and how they were fulfilled in the course of time. And some we might have a little hard time figuring out just what did Jacob mean. Others, we could very easily see the fulfillment of those. Now, we know they were all fulfilled because everything God says always comes about. But sometimes it's just a little harder for us maybe to see that based on the information that we have. Well, then, again, Jacob dies. Well, now what? Now, remember how Joseph ended up in slavery and ended up in Egypt. Remember his own brothers, 10 of them anyway, sold him into slavery. They first were going to kill him, remember? And then said, no, let's just sell him. And so now, as God's providence works, his brothers end up actually bowing down to their brother before they even knew who he was. And now they see Joseph as the ruler, second only to Pharaoh, and now their father has died, and so they're a little bit afraid of this. And what they're afraid of is that, well, maybe now Joseph is going to exact revenge on us for having done something very terrible, no doubt, couldn't argue with it, done something very terrible to him. And so we find that in verse 15 of Genesis chapter 50, When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, perhaps Joseph will hate us and may actually repay us for all the evil which we did to him. And so they send word to him saying, now before our father Jacob died, he wanted you to forgive us. Just to be honest, I'm not sure about that. We do not have a record of where they ever really went to Jacob. Maybe they were just making this up to try to appease Joseph. But it didn't matter, because Joseph had no intentions of exacting revenge, because, he said, this was all God's plan. And how could he exact revenge on them when God used all of this to save their very lives? And so he said in verse 19, do not be afraid, for am I in the place of God? But as for you, you meant evil against me. But God meant it for good, in order to bring about, as it is this day, to save many people alive. Therefore do not be afraid. I will provide for you and your little ones. And he comforted them and spoke kindly to them. What a wonderful heart Joseph has. But now I think we need to learn a good lesson from that. I know I do. Sometimes maybe I think people have done me wrong, and maybe people didn't do what they said they would do, or whatever it might be. And then I look back on it and say, you know, it's really a good thing. It's a good thing it didn't go like I wanted it to go. And then maybe I ought to learn from Joseph that maybe God's hand was in that, and there's no need to be angry with the one who really meant it for harm, because God used that. And so let's be careful when we look on be careful with our attitude toward others. Well, now we very briefly we see the end of Joseph's life. Isn't it interesting that we have all this information that we're given about certain segments of the life of these great patriarchs, and then all of a sudden we'll find that, well, it just sums up his entire life, the remainder of it, in just a few verses. Beginning at verse 22, so Joseph dwelt in Egypt, he and his father's household, and Joseph lived 110 years, and he was so blessed to be able to see his great-grandchildren, and through one son, his grandchildren through another, and then he knew it was time for him to die. Now, he's 110. His father lived to be 147. We find these ages gradually getting shorter as time goes by in the book of Genesis. And so Joseph said to his brethren, I am dying, but God will surely visit you and bring you out of this land to the land of which he swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. And he knew that now God's going to visit you. We're going to talk more about that word visit here in just a minute. He's going to bring you up out of here. Remember that God made those promises to Abraham. This was not the land of promise. This is Egypt. They are not living in the promised land. But they're going to. God's going to see that they make it back there. And so it says Joseph made them promise now. You don't leave my bones here. When God visits you, you carry up my bones from here. In verse 26, so Joseph died being 110 years old. And they embalmed him, and he was put in a coffin in Egypt. Now, that marks the end of our study of Genesis. But note the last couple of verses where he says, I'm dying, but God will visit you and will bring you out of this land to the land of which he swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. We're going to see that unfold in our next study. Now, I look forward to it, and I hope you'll join us every time. Now, let's just make a couple of notes here. In fact, if you have your study guide, you'll see these. Let me see what page number that is. On page 119 in your study guide. And you'll find now that Jacob was 91 years older than Joseph. Now, there's a generation gap, isn't it? Now, Jacob died at 147, which means now that Joseph was 56 years old when his father died. Now, think about that. Joseph was 56. Now, Joseph lives to be 110. And so he lived 54 years after his father's death. Well, keep that in mind. We'll come back to it. Now, think about what's happening in relationship to the famine. Remember the famine? There were those 7 years of great prosperity, and then 7 years of the worst famine they had ever seen. And when Jacob is moved and his family to Egypt, there are 5 years left. But now Jacob lived 17 years in Egypt before he died. So Jacob lived 12 years after the famine ended. And so things start returning back to normal in Egypt. The famine is finally over. And here's Jacob, 12 years, he's there. Well, now think about Joseph's duties. What was Joseph primarily responsible for? For saving them, really. For saving all of Egypt and the surrounding nations, because Joseph stored up the grain during the 7 years of plenty. He oversaw all of that great and momentous undertaking. And now during the famine, he sold grain to all the nations around there. And even the Egyptians, remember, sold themselves to Pharaoh and all their land. Joseph was the overseer of all of that, a tremendous work. But now he lives, remember, 66 years after the famine ended. So now what happens to his job? The famine's over. Well, at the time that Jacob died, which was again 12 years now after the famine ended, Joseph was a very honored man. And because of that, Jacob was bestowed great honor among the Egyptians. Remember when they went to his funeral, the people of the land, they went back to the land of Canaan to bury Jacob, and the people said, this is a great mourning for the Egyptians. And so because of Joseph's honored position, his father was treated with great honor. But now think about now all the years that are coming and going. And the famine is long since over. And most likely Joseph's role as the governor had probably ended, because again his job sort of played out. And we start seeing indications now that things are changing. The political climate of Egypt is changing, and this is very important. Remember what he told his brothers as he knew he was about to die. He says, now God, after my death, God will surely visit you and bring you up out of this place. Now that word visit has the idea of coming to their rescue. We think of visit like just a little friendly, you drop in to see somebody and say, well, they're coming over for a visit. That's not the meaning of the word here at all. It means you visit them, you help them in their distress. And so God would visit them. But now most likely they did not need rescuing yet. At Joseph's death, they were in the land of Goshen, the very best place in all of the nation of Egypt. And you think about now Joseph dies. But no mention is made of carrying Joseph's body back to the promised land. In fact, there's not anything said, is it? They don't even say that they mourned his death. Maybe they did, but it doesn't say it, and it's very careful to tell us that about Jacob's death. But there's just no indication that when Joseph dies 66 years after the famine, and people's memories, as you know, are very short. And so that's how the book ends. We end Genesis on a down note, you might say, in the sense that now God's going to need to visit you, to come to your rescue, and He's going to get you out of here. And yet they came there to survive. And wonderful things did happen to them while they were there, as we'll see when we begin our next study. But the wonderful thing that happened actually became a source of a burden for them. Well, as we end this study now in Genesis, remember what we've done. We have covered the first 4 periods of Bible history. Remember, we divided the Bible up into 17 categories. There was before the flood, the scattering of the people, and the patriarchs. So those first 4 now are covered. Our next study then would be the next 2 categories, which would be the Exodus and the wandering in the wilderness. And those are going to be very interesting. Now let me again say, if you have not yet ordered your study guide, do that. It's free of charge. Now this one is covering even more material than the one before. And what I'd like to do now is just very briefly, we'll just sort of give a little introduction into this one. And hopefully hopefully you'll decide, I want to be there because I want to learn about this next section of Bible history. Again, the title of it is, You Shall Be My People. This is when God chooses them and makes them a special people. Now, He started the process back with Abraham, but we're going to find they're going to become a mighty nation in Egypt, and God says, that's my people. Now, again, Bob and Sandra Waldron have done an excellent job. Much work and study has been put into this study guide for our benefit. And again, I encourage you to order this. Well, what we're going to do now in this study is we're going to cover Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, and the first 5 chapters of Joshua. Now, what we're going to do is going to be pretty ambitious. We plan to cover this in 13 lessons. And so, even more so, I want to say how important your guide will be, because we just won't have time to study the detail that will be given here. But if you order your book, you'll have it, and then you can study it at your own pace and whenever you need to go back and look something up in those particular books. It'll be a great reference tool for you to add to your library. When we go from Genesis 50 and verse 26, the very last verse, and then we turn the page in our Bible, and we get to Exodus chapter 1 and verse 1, you find now that it very briefly says here, the sons of Jacob. And then it says that Joseph has died in verse 6. All his brothers and all that generation. And so you can see history now changing. The story continues to unfold. Now their children were fruitful and increased abundantly and grew exceedingly mighty, and the land was filled with them. We read verses 6 and 7. And that's great, isn't it? But it poses a problem. See, politics is the same. It doesn't matter if it's today or thousands of years ago. People in power want to stay in power. And any perceived threat to that power, they want to eliminate it. And so we find then that a new king arises in Egypt. And notice the wording now in verse 8, who did not know Joseph. Now, I don't think it literally means he didn't know who Joseph was. But he had no regard for Joseph. It didn't matter to him all the great things that Joseph had done. Well, that was many years ago. And in fact, we don't know exactly how much time has passed between the last verse of Genesis and the first few verses of Exodus. We're just not sure. But we do know that all that generation has died, and then a new king arises, as is said, that just did not know Joseph. And so what's going to happen? Why, it says he's going to put them in bondage. He says in verse 10, come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply, and it happen in the event of war that they also join our enemies and fight against us and go up out of the land. Therefore they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with their burdens, and they built for Pharaoh supply cities, Pithom and Ramses, and so on. And so they fall into hard times, you might say. God's blessed them, they've been fruitful, they've multiplied, and now this king is afraid of them. And he puts them in bondage. Now, we need to understand this does not come as any surprise to God. Now, let's go back to Genesis chapter 15 and notice what God said to Abraham. Now, we mentioned this at the time, but let's just remind ourselves. Then he said to Abram in Genesis 15 and verse 13, know certainly that your descendants will be strangers in a land that is not theirs, and will serve them, and they will afflict them for 400 years. And also the nation whom they serve I will judge. Afterward they shall come out with great possessions. Now as for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace. You shall be buried at a good old age. But in the 4th generation they shall return here, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. Wonderful passage of prophecy. Every single word of it, of course, comes true. And we will see that in our study now that we will, quote, officially begin next time. But we'll see that they're going to be strangers in a land that's not theirs. That's Egypt. In fact, they're already there, aren't they, as we get to the end of Genesis. They'll serve them. We see that in Exodus chapter 1. And they will afflict them for 400 years. That's why I say it's not certain just how the progression goes from the end of Genesis to the first of Exodus, but for 400 years they are afflicted. God says, I'll judge that nation. We'll see that in Exodus. God will send mighty plagues upon the Egyptians. And then it says they'll come out with great possessions. We find that when they come out of Egypt, it says they plundered the Egyptians. Why? They were just giving them whatever they wanted. Here, take this, take these gold ornaments, take this jewelry, take these precious things. Just take it and go on, get out of here. God had so plagued the Egyptians, they were ready to see them go. And so they came out with great possessions. And sure enough, God says, they'll come back here, Abraham. Now, they'll leave for a while, and they do. Remember, Jacob moves his family from the land of Canaan, the promised land, to Egypt. They stay there a few hundred years. And God says they will leave there and they will come back to the promised land. And that's again, it's going to be our study coming up. Now, remember those three great promises now that God made to Abraham. He says, now, Abraham, I'm going to make of you and your seed now, I'm going to make you a great nation. And I'm going to give you this land where you are, again, the promised land. And through you and your seed, all the nations of the earth would be blessed. That's the spiritual promise that God makes to Abraham. Now, what does he mean by that? Well, Paul says in Galatians chapter 3, in verse 16, he says, now to Abraham and his seed were the promises made. He does not say, and to seeds as of many, but as of one, and to your seed, who is Christ. And so here we find that third promise made to Abraham has to do with our Lord, with Jesus Christ. Through thee and thy seed shall all the nations of the earth be blessed. Aren't you glad that God has made it so that you and I can be blessed through Christ? But now there were three promises, remember. The remainder of the Bible is the fulfillment of those three promises. Now the first of these, he says, I'm going to make you a great nation. We'll see that in our new study now when he says, you shall be my people. They become a great nation in the land of Egypt. And before they leave, they are organized and they are on their way to the promised land to then gain that second promise, which is the land. But in our study, from Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, first part of Joshua, they are becoming that great nation. And then the next category will be the invasion and conquest of the land, and that's where God will give them the second promise, which was the land. And so again, the remainder of the Bible will be these wonderful promises being fulfilled. There were 17 categories or periods of Bible history that we have broken our study down into. And we covered the first four, remember, in the book of Genesis. Before the flood, the scattering of the people, and the patriarchs. Remember some of those stories before the flood? Those would be the creation stories, wouldn't they? That's when God created the heavens and the earth. That's when he made man, of course. And then he put man in the Garden of Eden. And remember, that's when sin enters the world, when the serpent, Satan in the form of a serpent, comes to Eve, and he deceives her. And she eats of that forbidden fruit. And she gives it to her husband Adam, and he eats. And so sin enters the world, and death because of that sin. And then we find the first murder with Cain and Abel. How Cain was angry because his sacrifice was not accepted by God, and Abel, his brother, his sacrifice was, and Cain slew Abel, the first murder. And then we find the people multiply, but they become very wicked. And so we find that God decides that they're so wicked, he's just going to start over, you might say. He destroys the world with a flood, and Noah and his family were saved in the ark. And then the ark rests on Mount Ararat, and they get out, they offer sacrifices to God, and they journey then down through Mesopotamia and end up down around what we call Babylon today. And so they built the Tower of Babel, which is where the name Babylon comes from. And God doesn't like that. They want to stay together, and God scatters them by confusing their language. And then the patriarchs, that time we have just studied, comes. So there's before the flood, scattering of the people, and the patriarchs from Abraham down through Joseph. And then we come to the next, which is the Exodus. And we've mentioned that already, so we have the Exodus. And then what? Well, they leave Egypt, but because they sin, and they really doubt God's ability to lead them on into the promised land, God says, well, you'll just wander in the wilderness for 40 years until that unbelieving generation dies out. Then they can go into the promised land. And so we have the Exodus, full of hope, going to the promised land, and then we find the wandering in the wilderness for those 40 years because of their unbelief. Well, now it's time to invade and conquer the land. And so we have the invasion and conquest of the land. Now, Moses leads them out of Egypt. And Moses leads them during the wandering in the wilderness. But even Moses sins, and God does not allow him to enter the promised land. And so he turns over the leadership to Joshua. Now, Joshua then is the great military leader, of course, with God's providence and help. And he invades and conquers the land of Canaan. Well, then, of course, after that happens, we have a period of time called the Judges. Now, Joshua, great leader, but he dies. The elders who served with Joshua, they die. And then the people, as they often did, they would become unfaithful. And God would allow their enemies then to put them in subjection, subdue them, and then things would get hard, and they cry out to God, and God would raise for them someone to deliver them, and that person was called a judge. And so we have the period of time that we call the Judges. Well, then the Judges last until the days of Samuel. And then they said, no, we don't want these judges, and what we want is a king. And so they asked for a king, and reluctantly and with stern warning, God gives them a king. The first one being Saul, then David and Solomon. And so we have the period of time we call the United Kingdom. So we went from the Exodus to the wandering in the wilderness, the invasion and conquest of the land, and then the Judges, and now the United Kingdom. Now, the very fact that we are calling this category the United Kingdom implies that something happens in the divided kingdom, doesn't it? And so because of Solomon's sin, God allows the kingdom to be divided. And you have we just call it the divided kingdom. The United Kingdom, the divided kingdom. Well, the divided kingdom is made up of two. The northern kingdom, the southern kingdom. The northern kingdom is called the kingdom of Israel. The southern kingdom, the kingdom of Judah. The kingdom of Israel, the northern kingdom, is wicked predominantly the whole time that God allows them to exist. Well, finally, God has had enough, and He allows them to be conquered, and that leaves Judah alone. Well, Judah, unfortunately, does not remain faithful, and God allows Judah to be captured. And so we have the United Kingdom, the divided kingdom. We have Judah alone. We have the captivity. We have the return from captivity. God allows them to return after having been captured by the Babylonians. So for 70 years they're in captivity, and then they return. After they return to the promised land, we have nothing from God. We have what we call the years of silence. The years of silence last for 400 years and is broken with the life of Christ. And we enter then the New Testament. And from the New Testament, not as many categories. You have the life of Christ, and then you have the early church, and you have letters to the Christians. And so, in very brief form, there's the entire Bible. And we're thankful now that we are continuing this progress, and we look forward to starting this new study now next week. Why not join us? Order your study guide if you haven't done so yet. Thank you for joining us as we seek the old paths.